I'm Kelly Taylor Ryan, and this is Mainly Unspoken. Today, we have Richard Stevens, who is an attorney, and he wrote the most incredible book titled Dial 911 and Die. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much, Kelly.
Dial 911 and Die, the title is scary. What is this book about?
Well, it is supposed to get your attention. That's what the title, Dial 911 and Die.
Certainly does.
Yeah, it's designed to do that, and hopefully people will come and take a look at the subject matter. Let me set this up for you very briefly. It takes about 3 sentences to do it. Frequently we're told that we live in a modern age. We have the police, we have the FBI, we have all sorts of government agencies, and they're all out there to make us safe. So why in the world would anybody need a firearm? You don't need a firearm. The police are going to protect you from violent crime, so we're told.
Yes, that's right.
And the answer is, well, it sounds good on paper, but it turns out, and this book documents it in all 50 states, that the police do not have a legal duty to protect any individual against crime.
That's a shock to anybody.
Yeah, well, it's a fact, and it's important for people to understand if they put all of their defense eggs in one basket, and that's a telephone hanging on the wall, they're depending upon a system that does not owe them anything.
So if I was in trouble and I dialed 911, the police may or may not come.
They doubtless will tell you they'll make their best effort. If they can, they will come, but if you have to hold them to it, and the bottom line is, if they don't make it in time, if they make it they're too late, or they have some other kinds of problems and they don't make it, you're left on your own, and there's no legal recourse whatsoever.
Now, have people tried to sue? I would imagine there were all cases, you talked about the different cases in your book, where they try to sue police or the towns for not responding.
Right. Well, there are, in fact, my book has a number of cases exactly like that, and I can tell you the details of several of them if you'd like.
Sure.
But for example, in Maine, as of the time that I wrote the book, there was no printed, appellate decision about what the Maine courts would say, but there was a similar case to it, and that was a case in Lewiston, Maine, where the police stopped a car, arrested the driver for drunk driving and driving without a valid license, and took the car away. That is, they took the car keys away. Well, the driver, that's one thing, they arrested him, but the lady named Patty, they just left her there.
Well,
and she started walking home. Well, on her way home, she was attacked and robbed. She was injured pretty severely, and she tried to sue the city and the officers for failing to take care of her under the circumstances. You would think they would have some duty to not just leave her there in the street. Unfortunately, the Maine Supreme Court said, sorry, you can't sue the city unless they have an insurance policy that covers this kind of harm. And if they don't, you're out of here. Well, and that's exactly the kind of reaction you get in almost every court across the nation. If you dial 911, they don't show up, you can't hold them responsible. So you have to take care of yourself.
And I was reading about the case in Massachusetts, too, about the woman who her husband was threatening to kill her.
Oh, yeah.
And you want to explain that one? Do you remember that one off the top of your head?
That's a terrible case. That's gut-wrenching. In that situation, the lady was, as I recall, she had gone and she'd gotten a protective order from the court to try to stop her ex-husband from harassing her and bothering her, but the husband kept doing it, kept stalking her and all kinds of things, threatening her. And so on one fateful, in fact, in that particular case, the woman was told by a police officer, you really ought to get a gun because we can't protect you. Well, she didn't do that. So on one fateful day, the ex-husband comes over, attacks her, gets in the backyard, smashes through, comes through, drives her out, chasing her into traffic. You can just imagine she's screaming, running through traffic, getting across the street. She's banging on neighbors' doors. They don't let her in. Finally, the ex-husband comes up and shoots her. And in her case, as I recall, she did not die. She was instead almost a fate worse than death. She was paralyzed for life.
That's right.
From the neck down. And when she tried to hold that town, I think it's the town of Grafton, Massachusetts.
Groton, I think.
Yeah, tried to hold them liable for leaving her undefended. Here she had the protective order, and she had called the police and told them and all these things over and over again. And the Massachusetts court said, sorry, we don't have a duty. The government does not have a duty to protect you case closed. And it's kind of ironic in Massachusetts, where the prevailing view is sort of hostile to self-defense and defensive firearms, and yet the police officer had told her point blank, to coin a phrase, that she should take care of herself. And if she didn't, too bad, and that's how the court played it as well.
So why do people think 911 is there to protect them? And why do they think that police officers will protect them?
Well, I can't read the minds of everyone, but I can tell you a little history, and that is that the 911 system started in about 1968. I remember it. I'm that old, I guess. It started in 1968 and has been sold continuously by primarily the fire departments and also the police departments as being the central and sort of national way of reaching help when you need it. And so we have one and almost two generations of people raised, even in grade school, nursery school, told, if you have a problem, dial 911. My kids were taught that in their school. I don't know a kid in the country that doesn't know, if they see something wrong, dial 911. So they're trained to do it, and that's not all bad. What's important, though, is that people understand as adults that it is not the be-all, end-all of defense. And certainly, if you rely on it solely, you are relying on a system, as I say, that doesn't owe you anything, and that should make people think twice.
But people aren't told that. People aren't told that the police will not protect you. They may and they may not. They don't have a duty to protect you.
Right. Well, I don't think people ought to necessarily be angry at the police officers for not having this duty. I mean, this book is not against the police officers. It's not against the 911 dispatchers. It's just to put it into context, and then to show the contrast between what people have come to believe that they're promised. People have come to believe that they can depend on this system for their defense.
So isn't that like lying to the public then?
Well, but the deception is when someone turns around and says, well, now that we have 911, we're going to outlaw your private defense system.
Right.
See, now that to me is the immoral part of the equation. It's one thing to have an imperfect police system, an imperfect 911 system. We all have imperfect systems. But the real deception is when people are pushed to believe that that's what they ought to rely on, and that they should shun anyone who would think otherwise.
Mm. That's really interesting, because I was talking to a person in Maine about your book, and she hadn't read your book, but she said that you were absolutely right, and she's not an attorney, because her daughter was threatened by a man, and he said he was going to come over and kill her.
Oh.
And so the father got a shotgun and lay down on the floor with the gun to the door, and the mom called 911. And it took and this is a rural place in Maine. I mean,
yeah.
There's not a lot of traffic, and there is police in this particular town. And it took them 3 hours to get there.
Oh my gosh.
And the man that was in front of the house, but he was completely drunk. He had his gun on the seat. Now, if they had relied on the police, they would have been dead unless the father was able to kill the man with a shotgun. And if he didn't have a shotgun, they would have been totally defenseless.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And this plays itself out many, many times every year. We've got statistics indicating that firearms are used successfully to deter or stop a crime anywhere from 800,000 to 2 million times per year, depending on which study you read. But 800,000 is big enough, and 2 million is huge. And these are 93% of the time, not even a shot is fired, but the attacker is driven away. Most attackers are smart enough to realize they would rather not mess with somebody who's armed, and so they run, and they don't stand their ground or wait to get hurt. And so with that many defensive uses of firearms, it's silly for people to criticize the ownership of firearms and instead hand people telephones. And that's, again, to me, it's a moral question as much as anything, that you could hand someone a phone and say, here, use this, I'll take away your own defense system, but ha ha ha, if you depend on the phone and it doesn't play for you, too bad.
But what is happening in this country where they're not giving us this information? They're not going to tell us, or you don't hear on television or radio, the newspapers, how guns can save lives. You're not told that a police officer does not have a duty to protect you.
Yeah.
You're not told this. Why do you think we're not being given this information?
Well,
And
again,
then they
whys are such huge questions because we're talking about so many different entities in our society that have these views. But I have my own views about it, and they are basically that we are in a continuing battle, and I believe this is true throughout history, that is a continuing battle between the peaceful and the freedom-loving people versus the people who want to impose power. And one of the great ways of imposing power on someone is to make that victim believe he or she is a victim, and that they're defenseless and powerless and must rely upon the leader, must rely upon the protector. And when you have a lot of people relying on you and not questioning you, you have power. The ownership of firearms is probably the most significant way of indicating that you are an independent citizen, not a serf and not a slave. And America is known for this attitude. And that's why we have so many millions of people, I believe, coming from all over the world, because they understand that view, not just firearms, but just the general world view. We are independent, free people. And you can tell that because we maintain the right to keep and bear arms, that is, to use force to protect ourselves. We do not rely upon a king or a ruler or a committee or anybody else in the final analysis. That's our American way.
That's the American way, but I don't know if that's still alive, especially, we're encouraged to dial 911, and we have, 25,000 gun rules? Aren't there 25,000 laws about gun ownership?
Yeah, there's some number like that.
Some number like that. So it's not so easy to get a gun. It's very difficult in Massachusetts to get a gun.
Right.
Matter of fact, when I was in Massachusetts, I went to apply for a gun, and the police chief kept on saying I didn't need one. Any argument I came up, he says, no, we'll take care of that.
Yeah, sure they will. Well, now you have the book. You don't have to show him the book. You just ask him, okay, Chief, just give me a copy of the Maine Revised Statute, Title 14. Give me the copy anywhere in the Maine Revised Statutes that says that you have a legal duty to protect me, and if you don't, that you will pay damages. Just ask him for that law. Ask him for that case decision that says that they'll pay damages to you if they fail to respond to you and protect you. And you want full damages. You don't want just $1 and a handshake. You want full wrongful death damages. I mean, this is what the power of the book, and I'm hoping that people all across America will be able to use it in just exactly this way. Because now you know the law, or at least you know some of it, and you can say, look, I know you don't have a duty unless you're going to promise me and actually put money up here. Then don't tell me to rely on you. I mean, the thing about this is I was in law school when I first learned about this, and it shocked me. If you're a property owner in nearly every state, and somebody slips and falls on your property, you're responsible, right?
Right.
Especially if you left something out there, like a skateboard or a hole or a hose, anything. And the law will come and say, you owe this money because you didn't act reasonably, you were negligent, you let somebody get hurt on your property. Even if they're on your property without your permission, this can happen, right? Then you turn around to your public servant, and they say, well, sorry, we're in the business of protecting you, but you can't hold us responsible for it. How does that make any sense?
Doesn't.
Well, but I was just stunned. I thought I was kind of, I thought I was more sophisticated than that. And then I read those cases in law school years ago, and I thought, this is insane, and just absolutely insane. You can sue a ladder manufacturer for your falling off a ladder sooner than you can hold a city responsible for protecting you with all of their power and might.
But there are times that a police officer has to protect. You list, 5 of them in your book?
Yeah, there are a few, and they're rare, but they can occur. If you're, for example, if you're in a witness protection plan, if you've testified against the mafia, something like that, then they have expressly undertaken the duty to protect you. There are situations where the police actually tell you that they will protect you against a particular harm. And in situations where you've actually gotten a promise to you, then in many states that can be enforced. But how many times will that happen? I think you'll find that 911 dispatchers, for example, are trained not to make any such promise. They're not going to say, "Oh yes, we're going to protect you. Don't you worry. We'll send somebody out. Don't do a thing to protect yourself." They won't say that anymore. There are cases where they have said that, and that has led to litigation against them. But now they're trained not to tell people, "Oh, don't do a thing to protect yourself. We'll take care of everything." No way. They will never say that. And if they do, they're setting themselves up because they're making that kind of a promise. But unless there's some kind of a promise, or if you have some really strong reason to show a court after you've been injured and after you file a lawsuit, this is when it all comes down, and you're now trying to convince a court somewhere that the police owed you a duty, and they have the city attorney and everybody against you. It's a lose-lose proposition to depend upon even those promises in most cases.
But the police, they do defend the public.
Right.
And what's an example of that?
Well, the idea of defending the public but not any individual, that's the way the courts generally explain it. They call it a public duty. The police are there to generally deter. If there is no police, and I've been reading, for example, that there are some situations where the police have pulled back in certain areas and not been patrolling and that sort of thing, and the crime goes up. So we know that the police presence, the existence of the system, the detectives, all those systems, the 911 system, those are all deterrents to criminals. And so we know that's
as is gun ownership is.
I'm sorry?
As is gun ownership is.
Well, there you go. That's not usually talked about, but that's true too. But that's the public duty, and so the courts will say, well, the police owe a duty to protect everybody sort of generally, but no individual has any particular claim. So that's how they get around owing you a specific duty, but they'll owe everybody a general duty.
So, talking to the person in the street, you just say, you need to own a gun.
Well, I don't tell anybody that they need to. What I tell them is to evaluate what their risk is. And this is like every other security situation. This is not a book about requiring people or encouraging people who may not have any need for a firearm to get one, but it's rather to make them soberly aware that the risk is on them. Nobody else really bears it. So if you're in any situation that you believe you face any kind of risk that you'd like to deter, then you better take the steps yourself. As the 911 system and the police system and the governments and the courts and all that arrive after the fact and maybe too late. And if your risk is high enough, then you should seriously consider owning the tools and getting the training to defend yourself and your family. Right.
And you even talk about if there's a power failure and 911 system isn't online.
Zap. If it's not online, again, you're physically unable to make the call. And so now it's all almost moot, isn't it? I mean, you could say, well, they had a duty to protect me, but if the system is down, then you could sue them for not having their system up. But so what? If you're dead, it's just your heirs making this phone call. We had that terrific example of during the Los Angeles riots of the Rodney King era, where the police, and we knew this to be true, we could see it, that the police were not protecting individuals, they were not going into dangerous areas. So individuals were left to fend for themselves. And we have all seen the pictures and heard the testimony of the Korean storekeepers who used firearms. Sometimes they even used fake firearms, but they used firearms to drive away looters and rioters. Those folks who did not have a way to drive away the attackers were left as victims, and the police were not there, and nobody could hold them responsible for not being there. And I've got cases like that in the book, a case from Baltimore and several others where during riot situations, the police, the same rules apply. In many states, the police do not have a duty to protect anybody against a riot. And it's cold comfort even if they do, because, again, you inherited a lawsuit. You get to file and litigate for 10 years. It's not worth it.
No, it's not. But this is something that people just aren't aware of.
No. Somebody asked me once what should be done about the 911 system to make people aware. And this is really not a joke in my mind. If you put a product out on the market and it has some potential defects or dangers to the user, then you're required to put a warning label. And I truly believe that if you're going to put up a big sign that says, dial 911 in emergency on a phone booth, there ought to be something, at least in fine print somewhere, and maybe not so fine, that says, yeah, but there's no promise that they will arrive.
That's right.
Don't just stand there with a phone in your hand. I saw a terrible thing on television. It was a recreation. I think it was on America's Most Wanted. It was on one of those kind of shows where these two men were sharing a home in a semi-rural area, and they recreated this on television. And somebody, some evil guy had it in for them for some reason. I don't recall the motivation. But the bad guy comes on their property. The bad guy is armed. He kills the first man he sees, and then he sees the second man and chases him into the home. The second man is running. He's panicked. He's going upstairs. He goes into his home office. He closes the door behind him, and he grabs a phone. And he's dialing 911. And as you see the door breaking open during the recreation, and the bad guy kills him while they're cowering in the corner with a phone in his hand. I mean, it just makes you sick.
Right.
And yet that's the picture we're left in if we rely solely on 911.
Well, the book is great. I mean, you have so many different examples. And, of course, you discuss each state, all 50 states in there, and even Canada. You get into Canada. And I think what it left me with the impression is that, yes, I have to take that responsibility that I have to defend myself and my family. I mean, it's nice that maybe 911 might be there. Maybe they'll give some help. But when push comes to shove, it's me against the person who's attacking me, and I better know how to defend myself, and I better have the tools to defend myself.
Well, then, of course, you must have seen in the back of the book as well, I've got the 45 happy stories there, the stories with happy endings.
Yes, that's a good way to end this book. I was really happy about that.
It's pretty much doom and gloom up till then.
Yes, it was hard to get
I've got the 45 stories, and just so the listeners will know what they are, they're drawn from all over the country. They're stories taken from newspapers, and I give the citation to the newspaper, where people have successfully used firearms to drive away attackers, bad guys of all sorts. There are even cases where kids have done so. There's one a story where a young man, I guess he was about 14, and his siblings who were younger were in the home, and somebody was attacking them and smashing down their front door. Can you imagine the terror? And the kids run upstairs. They go into the parents' room. They close the door behind them and lock it. The bad guy's coming up. He's smashing at that door. Well, the 14-year-old had been trained in the proper use of defensive firearms, and the 14-year-old ended up shooting and stopping that attacker. That's 4 kids that aren't dead.
That's right.
There's a story there too about a young girl who had a peeping Tom. I love this story for its simplicity. She had a peeping Tom problem because she would be changing clothes in the morning, and this lecher would look through the window, sneak up and look through the window. Well, she told her dad, and her dad responded in a reasonable way. He offered her a shotgun and a handgun, and put it in her room, and said, "Okay, next time he comes, you point it at him." And she did. She pointed it at him the next time the lecher showed up, and that lecher skedaddled out of there faster than a hare and was never seen again. Another situation where what might have turned into some kind of a sexual molestation or an attack was stopped cold. And there's just story after story like that. I have senior citizen stories. I've got the 108-year-old man who drove away an attacker here. There are a lot of people whose lives depended upon their quick and effective use of at least the threat, if not the use of deadly force.
But we don't hear enough about this. What we hear about is like Columbine. And how would you respond to people? Well, you teach kids. I believe children should be taught how to fire a firearm safely. They need to know this safety issues there. But what about Columbine? You teach these 14-year-olds how to use a gun, and then they're going to go into the high school and kill everybody.
Well, if that were true, I guess we'd be worried about it. What you had there were 2 people who planned this for at least a year. We know this from the documentation and the videos. We know they planned a murderous spree on purpose. We also know that for at least 100 years before that, there were schools all over this country where there were rifle clubs, pistol clubs, firearms training in association with ROTC on campus, everywhere. I mean, use of firearms was everywhere, and there were no such murderous rampages. So what you had was 2 murderers. You didn't have a problem with firearms per se. You had murderers, and in fact, there were 2 terrible stories recently. One of them comes to mind in Japan, which is almost entirely disarmed, where a guy attacked, and you probably read about this too, he attacked kids in a school. He went in the 2nd grade, and he started knifing them. He killed 5 kids, and then he injured a whole lot more. So he was a little mini Columbine, because why? Just in Japan, as in America, these schools are big, huge targets, undefended targets. And the attackers know it. And for whatever reason that someone would be willing to kill another innocent human being, they will, and they seem to keep doing it. And so rather than sitting on our hands and saying, well, you know, let's make sure nobody knows how to defend ourselves, let's turn around and say, let's defend the places that are dangerous. Don't make it a federal crime to have a handgun or other kind of firearm on campus that could be used for defense.
Well, Aaron Zellman says in his book Hope, which is great, that a polite society, an armed society is a polite society.
True.
It is true. It is true. And maybe things like Columbine wouldn't happen if we were more of an armed society.
Well, we know from some of the other cases of school attacks, there's one of them where the vice principal had a firearm in his car. He left it in the car because he knew the law would get him if he had it on campus, so he left it in the car. And the attacker came on the campus, and the vice principal rushed out, got his firearm, came back, and stopped the bad guy.
Yeah.
You know, he had to go a long way to do what should have been easy. Here in Arizona, you may know, we have an open carry law, which allows a law-abiding citizen to carry a firearm almost anywhere.
Is that like in Vermont? Do you need to register at all or a license?
No, this is in the case of Vermont, as I understand it, they have concealed carry.
Right.
Without a license, as I recall.
So you have open.
In Arizona, it's open carry. That is, if you have a holster, you can carry it almost anywhere. There are a couple of exceptions, and they're fairly reasonable ones, but that's how they play it here. And I dare say that bad guys don't attack gun shows. Bad guys don't attack gun stores where people are there. They don't attack police stations.
And peeping Toms will not look in the windows of young girls who have shotguns.
Not more than once. It works. It's really elementary. I mean, this is not, you know, crazed gun-toting loony talk. We're talking about the simple use of a tool that is available to anyone who's not a proven criminal to make sure that they are defended against crime and that they retain their individual sovereignty. And that's what America's about, and that's one of the purposes of writing the book.
And would you say that more people are saved by guns than killed by guns?
Oh, I think it's doubtless true, given that there are, as I say, between 800,000 and 2 million instances of firearms use in defense, righteous defense, compared to the numbers of murders committed using firearms or any other tool. The numbers are like 10 to 30 to 1, depending on which numbers you want to use. So it's a huge advantage to be armed against bad guys, and we have no easy way of calculating how many crimes are stopped in the minds of the criminal because he or she knows that there's no sense in it. We know that Professor Lott wrote his book, and he surveyed the data all across the country, and he found a strong correlation between concealed carry laws and decreases in crime. So there's data there to suggest that the criminals know better. If they have a belief that their target is armed, they'll go somewhere else. They'll do something else for a living.
Absolutely. Richard, we only have about 30 seconds left. What's the one thing you want the audience to remember?
That the government owes you nothing.
Okay.
That's it. And I hope that they will also call our number, which is 800-869-1884. That's 800-869-1884 and order the book, or they can go online to do it. It's available at Amazon.com, for example, or at the website jpfo.org.
All right. Thank you, Richard. The book is Dial 911 and Die. You want to read this book. It will open your eyes and have you rethink on your responsibilities to defend yourself. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.